Hey guys, Enith here. Today I'd like to expand on the topic of my first video, which was about how to come up with a functional idea for a story. The next step is to take that idea and run with it. In other words, world building. Specifically, world building is the process that we can use to construct a world for our story to take place in. Why bother though? Well, building a world has some significant advantages over just jumping into a story with nothing but an idea. The first is that you'll have a world with much more depth. The goal of this process is to have a living, breathing setting for the story that you tell. One that reacts to the events of your story along with your characters and exists even when they aren't present. The second advantage is tied directly to the first. With a living world that you have with much more detail, you'll have an easier time avoiding writing yourself into a corner or having large plot holes. With that said, after asking people about why they don't world build before getting started, I'm usually given some variant of the same answer. The answer tends to be that it feels like it'll be way too difficult to do, and it's simpler to just let the world evolve as they write. This answer hinges on a particular way that most people see and interact with world building. Namely, that we only really ever get to see settings that are already completed. Let's take Lord of the Rings as an example again. It's got such a rich and complicated backstory with more named characters than most people will even remember, and they all interact in the background. The thing is, though, that what we see is the end result. I can promise you that it didn't spring fully formed into Tolkien's head as he was writing. Instead, he built up the world over time. Basically, it's important to remember that you shouldn't compare the first few steps of world building with something that's already done. It's obviously going to feel lacking in comparison when some completed works of fiction have an entire encyclopedia about their world. Furthermore, you have to keep in mind that as you do this, you're going to have bad ideas. That's entirely natural, but you can't let yourself get distracted by them. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind while I'm going over this is that this particular method of world building is designed to intentionally limit what's possible in your setting. The reason behind that is that if we know what we can't do, we know what we can do. There's some more detail on this that I'm glossing over at the moment, but once we've gone over the process and know more about how it actually works, I'll explain my reasoning. But for now, let's move on. I'm going to be using my novel Leviathans as an example again, so that you can follow along from the first video if you'd like. The first step of this process is to build off of the basic idea that we already had. We're going to be taking the broad answers that we found and consider their implications. We'll also be asking some more detailed questions while doing this, and we'll be focusing on how exactly these things limit our setting. Remember that while doing this step, we're going to be focused primarily on the big picture. We don't need to think about how these things work. We only need to know that they exist and that they do work. The details can come later. They're not important right now. So, let's grab some of the information that we had from the first video. The repair people, who I'll be calling technomages from now on, since that's what I ended up with in the novel, they're the people who can fix the magical technology in the setting. What are the broad consequences of that in the context of the rest of our information? Well, if the technology is rare and most people don't know how to fix it, maybe technomages are the only people allowed to mess with it at all. Well, I like that idea, so we'll run with it. If they're the only people that are allowed to touch the technology, though, what does that tell us about their place in the world? To me, it makes them special. It sets them apart. All right, cool. The limitations this places on our setting are pretty straightforward. It just means that you can't take a piece of magical technology and mess around with it to find out how it works. This leaves us with another question, though. How do technomages learn their craft if they're not allowed to interact with this stuff by themselves? Well, one answer to this question is that maybe there's kind of like a trade school or something. They gather in guilds and pass on their teachings that way. I like that too, so we'll stick with it. Next, we know about the adventurers and how they go out and find the runic technology, as I'll call it. Are there risks involved with this? I think that the answer here has to be yes. Otherwise, there would be way more adventures in the setting than we'd like. After all, there's supposed to be these sort of interesting people, right? Now that we know that there are risks involved, though, what can these risks be? The first thing that comes to my mind is just stuff like animals. Maybe the flora and fauna itself is dangerous. After all, if these adventurers are going to these lost and ruined places, they might find some crazy stuff. Another thing that comes to mind pretty quickly is that maybe the ruins themselves are unstable. Collapsing caverns, chasms that they have to figure out how to cross without bringing things down on their heads, all that stuff. Awesome. I think that works. With that said, if adventurers go to these places that are presumably far away from civilization, how do they even get there? What's their mode of transportation? Now, this is a fun one because we get to pick. It could be magically driven cars or planes or basically anything we want. I'm going to draw an inspiration from steampunk, though, and say that I like the idea of airships. Magically driven airships, big and small. All right. The last question I want to ask is whether there are nations and other political entities in the setting. I think that they have to exist. Otherwise, things don't make much sense here. So, let's think about a couple of basics about these nations. Are they spread out from each other? Do they interact a lot? I think they're probably pretty decently spread out. I'd say trade is still pretty frequent, but usually they leave each other alone. Maybe there's an occasional border skirmish between them or something. With that said, we've now got a whole other level of detail. And now that we have this extra detail, we can move on to our next step. Just like coming up with an idea for a story, it's important not to spend too long on this first step of asking these questions and answering them, or you'll get lost. Remember that you can always come back as you have more ideas or you look for more detail later. So for now, let's move on to the second step. We're going to take the limitations that the answers that we forced on our setting, well, we're going to find them, right? And we're going to build around them a little bit. This is pretty much the shortest step. It involves mainly just answering the obvious questions that that arise from what we found before. Oh, my dog appears to be seeing somebody outside. But yeah, so we're going to be, again, just to repeat in case my dog barking kind of cut that out. This is basically the shortest step because it's going to mainly involve answering the questions that arise from the stuff that we got above. We're going to be keeping it pretty simple again. So let's go ahead. We've talked a lot about runic technology and how technomages are the only ones that can fix it or even touch it. But if that's the case, how is it that adventurers go about finding and acquiring the stuff? Do they know how it works? I don't think they do. Since it's so restricted, it wouldn't make much sense for them to know how to do it, especially if adventurers were originally normal people. That means that a group of adventurers would almost certainly have a technomage with them. Okay, cool. We mentioned airships too. If we've established that they exist and that adventurers use them, do other people use them? I think they do. I like the idea of there being lots of different airships flying around all the time. Basically, having them be as common and understood as a car would be to us. We've also established that there are these nations. And can we use real-life analogs to make them easier to write and conceptualize? Sorry, I just got a message on my phone. I think that you almost always can use real-life analogs. And this particular case is no exception. Maybe there's a nation that's a mix of English and German influence, one that's Nordic, another that's East Asian. The specifics don't matter for the moment, but this sounds like a good way to lay the foundation for anything that we're going to be doing in the future. Well, that's pretty much everything that I can think of for the obvious questions, so let's move on. The third step is one that I have the most fun with, but it can also be the hardest. Sometimes, while we're building a world, we come up with new ideas about it. Things that we think are cool and might go well in the setting. Generally, once we have a basic foundation, it becomes easier to see whether or not these ideas will fit. So this is usually where I see whether they will. The important thing here is to think about your new ideas in the context of the limitations that our setting already has. If an idea can't be worked to make sense in the setting, we'll set it aside. Trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, in my experience, is a really easy way to completely stall your writing and end up with massive writer's block. I've done it, and frankly, it sucks. So while going over this process, while going through it, I had two ideas that I wanted to take a look at. First, I really like the idea of more traditional magic users. People who summon bolts of lightning or control fire. Maybe there's a group of those. But here, we immediately run into a problem. We've already decided that magic is very difficult, which is why people exclusively use runic technology. We even said in the first video that basically nobody did this, that I didn't want people running around throwing fireballs. But with that limitation in mind, can we make this idea fit into the setting? Let's give it a shot, see what we can do. Maybe the catch is that learning magic is really hard. Maybe it involves knowing the physical laws of the world, and you have to study for a long time to learn how to do it properly. Furthermore, maybe you can only learn how to do it in a specific place from a specific group of people. This limits things even more. Now, this might be enough, but I can think of another interesting way to have it fit into the basically nobody does magic idea. Maybe there are physical consequences to using magic. Something like a painful side effect. You go to use magic and you get a headache or a nosebleed or something. I like this because if we take all these things together, it would mean that only the most dedicated of people would even bother trying to learn magic. That's good because it means that this does fit our setting. It took a little bit of working, but it's looking good so far. Second, while I was thinking about the ruins that the adventurers explored, something came to mind. Doesn't a bunch of old ruined places filled with ancient technology nobody understands kind of sound post-apocalyptic? Would it make sense for there to have been a more advanced civilization that fell before the events of our setting? Well, I think this makes perfect sense. It complements the setting very well and lets us answer some questions about why things are the way they are. Furthermore, if there was an ancient civilization, maybe they left behind automated defenses that can be another risk for adventurers to deal with. It adds something more interesting there, too. If this is the case, though, how did the civilization fall? I'm going to take what, to me at least, is the most obvious answer. They had a full-scale war, and it tore them apart and left behind their remnants. Okay. With these two ideas now mostly working in our setting, we can move on to the fourth step. Here, we're going to consolidate what we know. For now, a lot of the information that we have isn't really connected. It's just kind of floating around. This is where we connect that stuff and see what happens. We're also going to be seeing if there's any new information that we can take from it as we do this. So, we've already established that the technomages and their guilds. We've also established that the adventurers are the ones who actually go out and find this new technology. So I think it makes sense that the technomages hire groups of adventurers or become their patrons, maybe providing a technomage to accompany them. That way, they get the resources they need to keep everything working. With that said, I think we can also say that who composes a group of adventurers isn't exactly that important. Anyone can theoretically be one, but with the risks we've established, it's a dangerous profession. With that being the case, most people stay away from it. This means that most adventurers have either exceptional talent or a very good reason to risk their lives. In other words, adventurers are interesting people, which is exactly what we wanted. On to the point of airships and how they make up the bulk of transportation. What might be some reasons that this is the case? Even if we don't explicitly state them for the reader, by keeping them in mind, we make them easier to write and add some depth in how we write about them. Well, for one, airships fly in a straight line, just like planes do. This makes them pretty fast, since they can avoid the problems of local geography, things like cliffs, mountains, rivers. Since they're driven by magic, they can also be pretty big and transport large quantities of people or material, depending on their design. That brings another thought, though. Speaking of their design, maybe each of the nations has their own airship designs. Just like how in the past different cultures had different shipbuilding approaches. You can identify ships from different cultures just by looking at them a lot of the time. I think that would be cool if it applied to the airships too. On to the topic of nations and political entities, we have some flexibility here, if we want to. If we want to, we can define some of these now to get a better picture of the world. It's perfectly fine to set them aside until they become more relevant to your story, too. Generally, though, I prefer to define a small group of important nations. I do this by attaching a few cultural traits to them, a system of government, and some basic visual elements. Now, when I say important nations, I just mean ones that are probably more politically relevant or are more... Sorry, let me just turn off the... There we go. That way, I can talk without being interrupted again. So what I mean by important nations is just nations that are more politically relevant in the setting. You don't really have to pick out how important they are yet, just ones that you think might be interesting. This helps me refer to these nations in more detail and can add a lot of depth to the story until you're ready to go deeper into the details of these nations. We talked about the magic users too, about how they have to learn their magic and the physical properties of the world to have it work. It makes sense to me then that they're at some sort of school or college or something like that. Some place where they learn math, science, and magic. That sounds about right to me. It fits in our setting. We can have it be somewhere remote or maybe even in one of the nations, perhaps. We've also decided that this takes place after the fall of another civilization. But that being the case, we should probably hint at this. Leftovers from when the civilization was around should do the trick. Old battlefields, abandoned cities, that kind of thing. These wouldn't necessarily be places that adventurers would go looking for stuff. Maybe they've already been picked clean or something along those lines. But these places need to exist to show continuity in our setting. This helps make our world much more believable, and it adds an air of mystery with nearly no effort on our part. With all that done, we've got enough detail to start workshopping the plot for an actual story. We can continue this process and come up with even more detail if we'd like, but that comes down to personal preference. Now, we have a world that our story can take place in. With this level of detail, we can imagine things that have already happened to get to this point, as well as what might be happening around the world. That means that the world itself gets to move along with our story. It makes things much more believable. After all, in real life, things don't really happen one at a time. They happen in parallel. So now, it'll be much easier to have our characters be doing one thing and have other things happen elsewhere. Before we wrap up, though, there's one other thing to talk about. Why build limitations into the world at all? Don't we want to be able to do whatever we want? What if we want something to happen that doesn't follow them? What if we want a character to break them? Well, in the real world, we know what can and can't happen, and these things are consistent. If you drop an apple, it falls. For a world to be plausible, it needs to have consistent rules. The limitations that we've established help us define these rules. More importantly, when we decide to break the rules, it's much more impactful if we've shown they exist. After all, a magic trick is amazing because it defies our expectations. Without those expectations, it's not nearly as interesting. So our job here is to establish those expectations. But I think that's all I have for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Next time, we're going to be talking about developing a plot that can take place in the world that we've created. And we're going to go through a couple of different ones that might fit. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy my content, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and click on the little bell so you know when I release a new video. Leave a comment if you have any questions, and if you want to know more about my writing, there's a link to my websites in the description. Talk to you next time.